Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Namir Islam. I am the Community Engagement Director and co-founder of MuslimARC, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. It is our first time doing an event here in DC, so I'm very excited to be here. And I'm excited to introduce you to our panelists and welcome you to this event. We have a lot of ground that we're going to be covering today, so it's not going to be as deep a dive as obviously we can get into for each of these different topics. Today is the 1-year anniversary of the Supreme Court ruling on the Muslim ban. It is certainly a day that I know a lot of people remember where they were at, kind of the emotional feelings of it going to the Supreme Court, the ruling that came down, all of that just reflecting a longer history of structural systems of oppression, right? And forms of law that are used to uphold certain discriminatory and immoral policies. Just because something is legal does not mean it's completely moral, right? So today we're gathering at this event to explore the history and the impact of structural Islamophobia. So through this panel discussion, we'll be discussing the law surrounding the ban, links between societal and systematic Islamophobia, and frameworks to understand Islamophobia. We will be providing that analysis and then providing some calls to action with at least one key item to be able to take away with you today. For our calls to action, we are looking to challenge structural Islamophobia at its roots, resist systematic bigotry of all kinds, and amplify the voices of people currently impacted by the ban today. So again, like I mentioned, we encourage you to live tweet the panel if there are some gems that you find from the panel, some things that you want to share with your wider network. Please do use the hashtag #BeyondTheBan. Other hashtags, the other community organizations, I want to kind of bring them into the room. There are so many organizations, Muslim-led and non-Muslim-led, who are resisting and challenging the Muslim ban in particular. And some of the other hashtags to think about are repeal the ban, no Muslim ban ever, and the No Ban Act. So all of these hashtags you're welcome to use. The panel is also live streaming. So again, at this number, you will be seeing the program, a detail to the live stream link if you would like to share it with anybody else. Lastly, we do have Q&A, some time set aside for Q&A. So on this website, you can go ahead and comment if you do have a question. We will be checking that. We also have note cards that you can put your questions on, and we will be gathering those around like 3:05 or so. Okay. So the Muslim ban, it is continuing to separate families, to deny people medical treatment, and to keep those abroad from pursuing deserved opportunities in the United States. As Rethink Media has been talking about, has been emphasizing, in January, they note that the Cato Institute estimated that over 3,700 spouses or fiancés of US citizens and over 5,500 adopted children of US citizens have been kept out of the country by Trump's Muslim ban. During the ban's first 16 months, only 5.1% of waiver requests were granted. So given this context, I wanted to turn first to our panelists, and let me introduce them very briefly. Iman Hassan is here with the Center for Conscience and War. So Iman's going to start us out right now by speaking about her experience as somebody. How has the Muslim ban affected your life, your family, your work, and your community?
Absolutely. So I myself am a refugee and have come to the United States through the resettlement program in Minnesota and arrived in Minnesota in 2001. So one, to see the very lifeline and the path that I have received to be cut off and systematically essentially stopped has definitely impacted me on a personal level, but also looking now at the statistics that came out from the 2018 year, 2016, the United States resettled 9,020 Somali refugees, and in 2018, they have resettled 250. So we can see that just statistically what it means that only 250 people have received the very important help that the United States has provided me, and sort of the legal the requirement of helping refugees. Looking at the waiver program that is provided by and has been spoken about in the majority opinion of the SCOTUS opinion that we will talk about in a little bit, that waiver requirement has only now provided 6% of those that were deemed ineligible, and then were provided the waiver. But if after asking the State Department again who were included in that 6%, it was essentially anyone that was erroneously included to begin with was also included in that 6%, but also anyone that was a dual citizen. So if you have a Swedish, Somali person that was applying for a visa, was erroneously included in the ban, and then states, oh, wait a second, I have a Swedish passport as well, that would also be included in the 6%. So just like Sotomayor predicted, the waiver program doesn't provide our communities at larger, but also the Somali community specifically, any support or help to reunite with families, provide important visas for those that are seeking admittance into the country for medical reasons, or even just educational reasons. That is just the structural, important legal effect that we have experienced. But anytime you label a community as inherently dangerous due to their religion, and the Muslim body in itself as the carrier of that national threat, when people do come, right, when the 250 people arrive in Minnesota or wherever they're accepted, this community then, the predominantly white, non-Muslim community, will see them as someone that not just needed to be extremely vetted, but that even after that vetting could provide for national danger. And so what do we do after we have legally, essentially, told these bodies that there's something inherently dangerous to the United States when they bring themselves over? And so we are in Minneapolis and in Minnesota experiencing a lot of the consequences of the structural Islamophobia that has been provided by the legal construction of the Muslim body. And so we are working through that currently, and every single day we have a new production of that violence that is created through that law. Yeah, so I could speak about, I mean, my personal experiences of having family members that can't come over, be reunited, or family members that are in refugee camps that continuously experience trauma. And I mean, when we think about it, it's not only that we said, stop, we no longer will accept anyone. We also said that the refugee resettlement program and the refugees that are still there will no longer be given as much aid as they used to receive. And I think that's another aspect that a lot of people aren't talking about. The UNHCR just stated that the Somali crisis is the most severely underfunded humanitarian crisis. So we not only said we don't want these bodies because of the threat that they present, we also said we don't want them to live any sustainable lives in the spaces they're currently existing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it really, oftentimes we talk about the stats and the numbers around it, but there are so many individual stories and communities that are impacted. And I really appreciate just the way that you've been able to draw that link between the abstract nature of the law and the impact that's having, not just here, but abroad as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much. In terms of that legal history, I think it's really important to sketch that and go over that history a little bit to just get a sense of how we got to the Muslim ban as it is right now. There are all these different versions and all these different things that were happening. So I wanted to go next to Abid Ayoub. And Abid is also an attorney as well. He serves as the National Legal and Policy Director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. And Abid, could you tell us more about that history, the legal history around the Muslim ban?
Sure, and thank you for showing up, and thank you to my co-presenters for all the work they've done on the Muslim ban and other issues on behalf of the community. To discuss the legal framework of the Muslim ban, you have to go back to before the Muslim ban itself and have an understanding that the structures and mechanisms in place to allow something for the Muslim ban have existed for decades, if not since the founding of this country. So to think that the President Trump just all of a sudden pulled authority from thin air to implement a Muslim ban is the wrong way of looking at it. The Supreme Court did uphold that he has authority, that the president has authority to determine who can come in and out of this country. The Supreme Court did not weigh his statements or did not look at the discriminatory nature of his statements made on the campaign trail. This is why when Donald Trump said, I'm going to ban all Muslims, you had from the legal community a little bit of an uproar and shock because they understood that the authority does exist. And it's going to be hard to overcome that. In fact, prior presidents have used similar tactics. If you go back to Jimmy Carter, who at one point banned Iranian students from coming in George Bush I banned Iraqi nationals from coming in for a short period, Kuwaiti nationals. So the authority is there. The Supreme Court simply said, you know what, this authority exists, and we're going to uphold it. So we're dealing here with a structural problem. We're dealing here with something that has existed for decades and something that the Supreme Court has upheld. Before we get into that, you know, the No Muslim Ban Act and what we could do forward, just, you know, to keep in mind quickly, yeah, there have been multiple versions. I remember just losing track. Every few months you feel like there's a new Muslim ban. But, you know, the one that's in place was the one that was implemented in December 2017. And just to go, it's Libya, Yemen, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Somalia, Venezuela. And each one of them has different categories. So that's the one that is in place now. As mentioned, the waiver process is a farce. And I think that was discussed in some of the dissenting opinions and even on the bench. The waiver process is non-existent. Less than 5% of applicants applying for a waiver are receiving it. That's almost nothing. And we deal with these, at ADC, we deal with these individuals regularly who put all their hope and all their faith in a waiver process that unfortunately has no guidelines. There is no system on how to apply, and people are lost trying to apply for a waiver. So it's definitely a difficult position that they're in. And the waiver process, again, I'll say, is a non-existent process. We're happy for those that have received it, but you have thousands of more that have not. So moving forward, whenever we take the legal approach, just know these mechanisms exist. This is structural. This is a big battle we have ahead of us. And it's not just going to be dependent on the courts or on lawsuits to overcome it. There are going to have to be legislation. There's going to have to be some more protesting, having our voices heard. So it's definitely a long process. And definitely the mechanisms that allow for the Muslim ban are structural. The Islamophobia is structural. And we do have a big problem with the system in this country.
Could you expand a little bit around that aspect of like just the courts alone? Like, why is it that just the courts alone won't necessarily dismantle this?
I mean, that's a good question. And the answer is what we received a year ago today. If you put all your faith in the courts, you know, one appointment this way or two appointments this way on the Supreme Court, and you're dealing with a generation of bad law and policy. So there has to be a focus on, you know, how do we push legislation through? How do we attack this on the local level? How do we attack this on a state level? You know, what different steps could we take and strategies could we take? So that's why there's a lot of campaigns and efforts out there doing this. But as an attorney, I'll tell you, I don't have full faith in the court system. We have seen what happened when it comes to the Supreme Court nominations. If this continues another 4 years, or if we have another appointment go to the right, it's going to be hard to depend on the court. And we're going to be entering an era in this country where the Supreme Court is going to be a rubber stamp for upholding structural racism, structural Islamophobia, and basically like a white supremacist agenda. And this is a scary line we're at now.
The Ninth Circuit can only do so much. I think every Hail Mary that goes to the Ninth Circuit, we have to recognize that they can only do so much to help us.
Thank you both. So next I want to, because we're kind of, as we're going through this, right, we're thinking and expanding out from just thinking about all these different areas that the law intersects with public policy, with all these different, you know, areas. I really want to go next to Dalia Magahid. So Dalia is the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU. And for Dalia, I really want to explore this link between social Islamophobia as well as structural Islamophobia, and thinking about those links when it comes to the people that we're looking at this country, right? And we're thinking about this broader base of advocacy and of policy work that needs to happen that's not just tied to the courts and not just tied to the Ninth Circuit. So could you please talk a little bit about that? And Dalia is going to be sharing some
Thank you. I'll go
slides
up
for
to
us.
the...
So thank you so much, Namira, and thank you for all making it out here on such a hot day. What I'll be discussing today is, like you said, the link between societal Islamophobia, meaning the kind of Islamophobia you might run into in your day-to-day life if you are identified as a Muslim, and structural Islamophobia, the kind of Islamophobia that the government institutionalizes. So we at ISPU have been doing survey research on American faith communities for the past 4 years. And we just released our latest study in May of this year, where we have created an Islamophobia index. We can actually measure societal Islamophobia year to year. And our key findings from that study were that Islamophobia inched up in 2019 versus 2018 in terms of on a societal level. But we also found that support for the so-called Muslim ban does little to help candidates. So I think that that's an important piece to keep in mind. Social Islamophobia is linked to support for structural Islamophobia. So the two are not, they're not independent of each other. They are empirically linked. And that if we want to attack or if we want to address societal Islamophobia, from the data, what we found is that things that predict lower Islamophobia are knowing a Muslim, knowledge of Islam, and positive views of other minority groups. So first, the piece about Islamophobia on a societal level has inched up from 2018, where it was at 24, to 28 in 2019 on a 0 to 100 scale. So it is not a dramatic change, and even according to our index, it's not alarmingly high in terms of at a societal level. The other thing we know is that endorsements of the Muslim ban does little to help candidates with most voters. So we looked at this question across faith communities in the United States. Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, and then we looked at white evangelicals within the Protestant community specifically, as well as non-affiliated Americans and just the general public. And we found that even where the Muslim ban has its highest support, which is white evangelicals, even there, a majority is not saying that they would increase their support for a candidate if they endorse the Muslim ban. So it's something to keep in mind as we're moving into 2020, that when candidates make this part of their policy platform, it's in fact not helping them with most voters. Now, why should you care about social Islamophobia? Why should the endorsement of anti-Muslim stereotypes at the public level matter to you? Because of these links. A higher Islamophobia index, a measure of the endorsement of anti-Muslim stereotypes at the public level, are linked to greater acceptance of military targeting of civilians. They're linked to greater acceptance of even individuals targeting of civilians. So it's linked with acceptance or support of violence. Second, it's linked to greater acceptance of authoritarian attitudes, suspension of checks and balances, as well as limiting of freedom of the press in the case of a terrorist attack. So Islamophobia at the societal level makes us less safe and less free. It's also linked to, unsurprisingly, greater discriminatory policies towards specifically Muslims, including the Muslim ban. And that's where structural and societal Islamophobia are linked. The more the public endorses these stereotypes, the more support they have for these policies, and then the easier it is for politicians to move forward with those policies. I'm just going to very quickly go through what we found predicts lower Islamophobia. So if that's something we want to work on, if all these things that societal Islamophobia predict are bad for society, how do we address societal Islamophobia? So strong predictors of lower Islamophobia, being a Democrat, so it's very partisan, favorable views of African Americans, favorable views of Muslims, unsurprisingly, but also favorable views of Jews and the LGBT community. All of these things predict lower Islamophobia. And then knowing something about Islam, knowing something about the faith is a strong predictor. Moderate predictors of lower Islamophobia, favorable views of feminists, knowing a Muslim, and high income. And here are the things that don't matter. Nativity, whether you're an immigrant or not. Sex, women are not inherently less Islamophobic. Age, young people are not inherently less Islamophobic. Education, just having more years of school doesn't make you less Islamophobic. And religiosity, being more devoted or less devoted to your faith doesn't actually matter. So I'm going to end with these data-driven recommendations. Build coalitions with other impacted communities. These communities are linked empirically by the threats that they face, so they should work together. Keep demystifying Islam as a faith. Do more than interfaith, because Islamophobia is actually not linked to religiosity. So the kind of outreach that needs to happen has to go beyond simply interfaith. And then finally, make Muslim friends. Thanks.
Thank you, Dahlia. So as we're kind of thinking and getting even deeper into all these different things that are bringing us this understanding of which communities are impacted, as we're thinking about which communities are aligned, all of these different intersections that are happening as well, I really want to throw it now to Dr. Maha Halal. And Maha is the co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective, where she focuses on political education addressing institutionalized Islamophobia. So Maha, you have worked extensively on state violence and the intersections and thinking about how Islamophobia and state violence are intertwined. So could you address that and talk about kind of what you have found and how is state violence linked to all of these different issues?
Yes, absolutely. So one thing I think is important to start off with is, this morning I was at a press conference on the Muslim ban, and a lot of the narratives that were said were around the fact that the Muslim ban is un-American, or the Muslim ban is not something that is steeped in US history, right? It's an aberration. And we know that that's not true, right? We know that it is, in fact, a very big part of this history. And it has targeted numerous groups throughout the history of this country. I can't do this justice, so I would encourage you to read this particular article called America's First Muslim Ban in 1503 by a scholar named Margarita Rosa, who specifically talks about enslaved Africans and the ways that they were banned from coming to this country because of their religion as Muslims, specifically the construction and the belief that Muslims were rebellious and that they were able to hold on to their religion. So this isn't the first Muslim ban, right? And when we look at immigration policies in general, my reference point is 9/11 because that's what I've focused my research and scholarship on. This isn't the first time, right, that such a thing has happened. We had the NSEERS program, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, in 2002 and 2003, which targeted 25 countries, 23 of which were Muslim majority countries. So there are numerous ways, of course, that Muslims have been targeted specifically in the immigration realm. But beyond that, the war on terror is specifically rooted in this idea of differential justice for Muslims. And there are so many ways that this has happened. Tonight I'll be speaking on the issue of Muslims being tortured in the war on terror, because today is also the UN Day in support of victims of torture. And when we look at the torture apparatus, for example, the torture of Muslims began because of a series of memos that essentially legalized torture, that said, in order for abuse to rise to the level of torture, it had to result in organ failure or death. This was overtly practiced, right? Prior to 9/11, we knew that the US tortured people, but it wasn't legally sanctioned in the same way that it was post 9/11. We also think about material support for terrorism. There's a Patriot Act. There are a number of ways that Muslims have been targeted in this realm in particular. Many charities post 9/11 were forced to shut down because the government alleged that they were supporting terrorism. There's the use of drones. And drone use is very important in particular because it targets many of the countries on the ban. And so it's ironic, right, that we're not only destroying countries abroad and participating in rampant militarism, but we're also then banning people from the countries that we've destroyed from entering this country. And so that's very problematic, right? And that's also symptomatic of a larger narrative that the US's national security apparatus is rooted in, is that we're always the victim. The US is always the victim of other people's actions. And when you position yourself as always being the victim, then other people's behavior doesn't matter, right? It's not rooted in anything legitimate. So this is something that has happened over and over and over again. There's been rampant use of informants in the Muslim community, right? And that serves a specific purpose, which is to destroy the Muslim community, which is to break bonds, which is to, ruin the community's infrastructure. And this has gone practically unabated. In conjunction with this form of state violence, right, and these multiple forms of state violence, we have societal violence. So hate crimes post 9/11 increased dramatically. In the first year, in 2001, when 9/11 happened, I believe there was about 400 hate crimes that happened thereafter. Subsequently, the number of hate crimes has never gone down to the levels it was prior to 9/11. So this is important, right? And hate crimes exist within the state violence structure. It's the state that sets the precedent for how certain groups can or should be targeted that society is then echoing, particularly when it comes to the fact that there is very little accountability whatsoever for state actors. So society is just mirroring the violence of the state. And that's very important, right? And so when we think about state violence, there's a long legacy of this in this country, post 9/11. I mean, I could go through a million different things on the timeline that have happened. But, again, one of my focus areas is the topic of torture, okay? And for those of you who are not familiar with this particular program, from 2002 to 2008, the CIA ran a rendition, detention, and interrogation program that tortured Muslims exclusively. So again, we're talking about a differential system of justice. What is okay for the treatment of Muslims? And this, what is okay for the treatment of Muslims in one context extends the boundaries of what is acceptable for the treatment of Muslims in other contexts. So this is quite graphic, but there was a report that came out in 2014 around the torture that was conducted by the CIA. And some of the tactics that were used is rectal feeding. A prisoner froze to death while being chained to a concrete floor. Prisoners were forced to stand in stress positions on broken feet and a prosthetic leg. Another prisoner had his eye removed. And the list goes on and on. And so one of the reasons, too, I focus on Guantanamo torture and the CIA in particular is, again, because I believe that there are specific tactics that, again, have extended the boundaries of what is acceptable treatment. So if you have these very aggressive and brutal ways that Muslims are being targeted in one context, then the Muslim ban doesn't seem as bad, right? And that's not to sort of measure which policy is worse than the other, but it is to say that people are viewing, politicians are extending this brutal treatment of Muslims. And, it's extremely important when you think about state violence to think about how Islamophobia is specifically embedded, right? Whether or not a policy is neutral on its face, it's not necessarily neutral in implementation, and we've seen that time and time again. And so I think it's really important to, not only bring light to state violence, particularly that which is driving people out of their homes, and then which is denying them the right to come to this country, but also the precedent it sets for society, and generally what we think the history of this country is. Because if we deny what the history of this country is, then we can't really get at the root and dismantle the multiple systems of oppression that are at play, that are continuing to marginalize multiple communities.
Thank you, Maha. And I want to take a moment to just take a couple breaths, because this topic is heavy, and I want to acknowledge that these types of systems of oppression, they sit in our bodies, right? I don't want to ignore the impact that it has on mental health, on the physical health of people. So just join me, indulge, if you will, right? Take a deep breath. and exhale. One more, deep breath. And exhale. Okay, last one, deep breath. Okay, and exhale. And I want to acknowledge too, just like, as we're talking about this long history, and as we're going to be diving even deeper with this next question on systems of intersecting oppression, I want to also uplift the long history of people who have always resisted, right? We're in a position today because people have always challenged and fought back. And that's not going to go away. The fact that you all are in the room right now means that it's not going to just stop. So we are going to try and understand things at its roots, at its core, so that way our actions are as efficient as possible when it comes to dismantling these systems that are impacting communities, right? And one other additional layer that we'll come back to, please do write questions if you have questions to dive deeper into some of these topics, is again Iman's work, right, at the Center on Conscience and War, defending those who are objecting to carrying out some of these policies. So it's important to just think about that as well, that what happens when somebody disobeys? When it comes to state violence, when somebody says, no, actually, I'm not gonna do this, what happens, right? So as we're thinking about this broader framework and broader structure, I wanna move next to Vanessa. And Vanessa Taylor is here with us based out of Philadelphia today, so the Midwest will always be home, Minnesota especially. And Vanessa uses writing as an extension of community work. So Vanessa, you've specifically written on various topics, including the intersections of something that you've dubbed anti-Black Islamophobia. You also talk about homophobia and Islamophobia. And thinking about all these different systems and how they intersect, the Muslim community is one of the most diverse faith communities in the country, right? And when we're looking globally as well, there's not just one ethnic community that Islamophobia targets. So as we're looking at all these various systems, various aspects of identity, Vanessa, could you speak more to these intersections?
Yeah, absolutely. So I could talk about anti-Black Islamophobia alongside how homophobia impacts Islamophobia, or specifically how homonationalism impacts Islamophobia. But for the sake of having 5 minutes, I'll talk about them separately. So often when we talk about Muslims, we do focus on a non-Black Muslim as the inherent subject. And so there's generally a default assumption that Muslims are Arab, that Islam is foreign or new within that, and et cetera. And that's not to say that Islam is ever going to be compatible with the United States, because due to the construction of this country, it's not. The first Muslims in the United States were enslaved African Muslims. And so that's why I say Islam in the United States cannot be compatible. Because in order to try to make them so, you are ignoring the people who were enslaved, my ancestors who were killed here, brought here and killed here, who were excluded from the religious, who suffered under that, who suffered for this country to build itself. And so when we talk about Islamophobia, I choose to begin my analysis, for the United States at least, and you could go back further globally, with the enslaved African Muslims who came here and the exclusion, as I said, of Black people from the category of the religious. And this exclusion is why we do not often think of Black people when we discuss Muslims. Never mind that Black Muslims make up 1/5 of the United States population, according to the Pew Research Center. And so when I talk about anti-Black Islamophobia, and this is a term I picked up from a writer whose name I forgot, but she's a Black woman based out of Quebec who's writing within that context as well. But I picked that term up from her, and I frame it within the afterlife of slavery as defined by Saidiya Hartman. Again, thanks to this other writer who I will credit on my Twitter. But the afterlife of slavery sounds exactly what it sounds like. It refers to how slavery is continuous despite it being demolished or illegal, which again, I'm putting the quotes on purpose. We see how Black people are denied the category of humanity, how Black people are dehumanized and viewed closer to animals than they would be to the rest of the population. And so by centering anti-Black Islamophobia within this specific context, it allows us to analyze what happens to Black Muslims. So for example, preceding 9/11, Muslims have been surveilled as early as, depending on how you define surveillance, as early as the 1920s with the Moorish Science Temple of America. And this is looking at surveillance through the lens of government agencies. It's not really looking at how surveillance impacted Black people before, for example, on the plantation within that structure. with the ledgers, with the slave passes, et cetera, with the rulings that made it so Muslims could not practice their religion. And so Muslims had to start picking up kind of hints of Christianity and kind of hiding what they were really doing. And so, like I said, it began as early as the 1920s with the Moorish Science Temple. Then the Nation of Islam was surveilled. And me bringing up these names might make people feel some type of way, because they might feel that these were not actually Muslims. But regardless of your theological or political differences, what is important to remember is how the state categorizes people. Because ultimately what we're seeing is the state exercising the power to decide who is Muslim. And so black people who were within the Moorish Science Temple and black people within the Nation of Islam were regarded as black Muslims specifically by the state. And so what we saw specifically due to the Nation of Islam was how anti-blackness started to work alongside that Islamophobia then. So for example, if we look at prisons within California in the 1950s, I believe it was, they began to regard anybody who's a black radical as black Muslim. It didn't matter if you were actually Muslim. That made no difference to them. So again, what we see here is the state exercising its power to determine what Muslim means and who is Muslim, and then subject them to punishment based on that. And now moving forward, we see it not exactly a reversal, because we do see black Muslims kind of removed from being Muslim, but we're still resting within that blackness. And so although we might be removed from that category at times, and I'll use the example of, because I've written about this, black Muslim women who may not bear the proper outside markers to be regarded as Muslim, and the state deciding that you're not when you're within detention facilities, jail, etc. So let's say for this example that your hijab is removed. That is still Islamophobia. It doesn't matter if the state doesn't regard you as Muslim. So what we're seeing is how Islamophobia can kind of shift and wave itself, even if people aren't looking at you or automatically thinking that you're Muslim. And so I use this framework because, again, black Muslims make up such a large portion of the United States. And the experience that we have are very, very different compared to non-black Muslims. I'm from Minneapolis. And so I see how countering violent extremism, a surveillance and entrapment program, has targeted the Somali community. And although it piloted in two other cities, so 3 total, 2 of those cities targeted the Somali community. And we see how different it is there from how it would ever try to impact non-black Muslims, how they can rely on the criminalization of blackness to then add another level to what is happening to Muslims. And then, with the context of Islamophobia and homophobia, so there's a couple different ways to look at this. So first I'll talk about it from kind of the outside, so not within the LGBT community. So one thing we see happen is that Muslims are kind of reduced to, well, they are reduced to a stereotype. And in particular, Muslims are seen to only have a sexuality that exists in 1 or 2 senses. So for the women, it's oppressed, as in Muslim women cannot access their sexual agency. And then for the men, it is repressed, as in Muslim men are sexual perverts. And we see this pop up in cases of torture, where pictures that leak show them posing Muslim men in homoerotic positions, because the assumption there is that for the Muslim man, who is generally viewed as Arab in this context, the worst thing you can do is to put him in this position. That is the most dehumanizing thing you can do, because Muslims are inherently homophobic, and so their minds can't comprehend this, right? And so that lines it up with torture, but it also allows for something called pink washing. And so this is really popular when we talk about Israel and Palestine and the genocide that is occurring there. But often Israel will kind of paint itself as a haven for LGBT people. And the United States does the same exact thing. But then it will say Palestine or any other Muslim, country or Muslim communities in general are inherently homophobic, and they are terrible to people. And we need to save queer people from them. Never mind that LGBT Muslims exist. Never mind that the United States is responsible for so many atrocities against queer and trans people today. I was in middle school before we even legalized same-sex marriage. Never mind that that's not really liberation, but still. And so in Palestine, we also see Israel will come in and essentially do the whole pink washing routine, but on the flip side, will threaten to out any Palestinians who don't cooperate with the state. And so that's how you see the intersection of homophobia and Islamophobia outside of the community. But within the LGBT community, what also happens is homonationalism. And so that's from Just Bir Puar. And so queer men often, but queer people in general, are able to kind of gain access to the state by buying into Islamophobic rhetoric, by kind of cooperating with the state in that sense. And it is a play on both homonormativity, which seeks to gain acceptance through participating in heteronormativity to an extent. And so that is where we see, for example, the emphasis on same-sex marriage as the end-all be-all for queer liberation when it's not at all. And so with homonationalism, within the LGBT community then, we see Islamophobia taking on a new shape, because not only are we then getting Islamophobia from the dominant society that we're in, but it is also a chance for people to buy their way into that sort of power. And when people see the opportunity to get power that they do not have, they're often willing to do very vile things, and things that will generally go against the politics that kind of led to the establishment of that community.
Thank you. I want to emphasize a couple points as well that Vanessa just made. One, if we're thinking about this long, long history around structural and systemic forms of surveilling Muslims, of targeting Muslims, I mean, we can go back as far as the 1400s, right? So when we're thinking about like the doctrine of discovery, some of these earliest European, papaldom kind of like rulings that came out where it's like, well, as a Christian nation, you are allowed, you have this right to go into another land if they are Saracens, if they're Muslims, if they are people who are not of the Christian faith, and to take their land and enslave their people, right? And this is something that is by decree that has been allowed in the early 1400s. So when we're looking at that kind of framework that has existed for such a long time, allowing for all of these different systems when it comes to genocide of indigenous populations, when it comes to anti-blackness, slavery, oppression, and when it comes to xenophobia and Orientalism, these roots are, centuries in the making, and we're seeing very specific forms of it throughout the specific American project, right? And another way to think about this as well, oftentimes people have this tendency to try and exceptionalize Muslims out of these other systems. And just one example to kind of track it and to think about it, when we look at something like how the Nation of Islam was treated, right? And thinking about these headlines back in the 60s around, why do the black Muslims hate us? Who is the us? And who is being characterized as a threat, right? And we're looking at systems of COINTELPRO and certain systems that have morphed into things like the War on Terror, targeting specifically Muslim communities. And then as this apparatus has been developed, has been fine-tuned, and has been sold on the basis of anti-terror, it's become more acceptable to so many people because of that specific narrative, right? And nowadays, we're seeing that shift again to be able to expand to include black identity extremists, right? To include water protectors at Standing Rock and other indigenous and native protesters. And so we're seeing this fluidity amongst the system that has been tracking and targeting specific communities. And yes, the forms might be unique in many ways, but the roots are coming from the same place, right? And it's important to understand and think about how this is happening, because as Vanessa pointed out, different communities, when they have access to power in different ways, they sometimes will utilize that. And dehumanizing certain groups is certainly a way to get some sense of power in a system that is structured on access to resources and against withholding of resources from certain groups, withholding of humanity from certain groups. So as we're thinking about this, we're looking at this kind of broad space. I want to start thinking about, okay, we've got these narratives that exist, right? We've got this knowledge that exists in the world that's allowing this space for social Islamophobia, for law, for state violence, for all of these different things impacting different communities. We then have all of these policies, right? And we have these consequences on communities. As we're thinking then, and moving out a little bit differently, to think about what it is that we're gonna be doing about all of this, right? What has been done before, what is happening outside of this room, what is happening from the people in this room, right? There's no such thing as passive anti-racism. We have to be active. We have to choose to resist the current flow of everything that is happening. So what are the ways? I want to open this question up to all of the panelists now, given what the crash courses, right? Like I mentioned, all of these topics you could spend a lifetime on, right? What are some of the ways that we can start to challenge? What are some of the ways that we can resist both the Muslim ban and move beyond the Muslim ban, right? We're gonna spend like about 10 minutes on this, and then give you all a key takeaway, and then open up for questions. So if you do have questions, please start jotting them down. But I want to open this up to the panelists. Whoever is feeling the energy to go first, what are some of the ways we resist? And I'm always comfortable with silence because sometimes you just gotta absorb, right? All the active listening. What are some of the ways we resist?
I'll start off. You got to be organized and focused on what it is we want to do. We got to be focused, and we got to work together on a lot of these issues. And I mentioned in my statements, don't be too dependent on the legal strategy. So I'm probably giving you one way, not to resist is like, don't be so dependent on the legal strategy. And I know it's, when you see impact litigation, it's shiny, it's brand new, and you think it's going to go this way. But we have to look beyond just the courtroom. We got to look into taking matters into our own hands. And that means, protesting, being out there, being in the streets, whatever methods you feel are going to make the most noise to educate individuals and to educate people. And use facts, use statistics. I mean, the ISPU is a great resource, and we use them in our work. And when you come in equipped, you come in prepared, you have your information, you have your talking points, you're educated on the matter, you're going to be able to hold your own and push your agenda forward. So really get to learn the information, be focused, and have a plan of action on it.
I think you should use the resources and the knowledge that you have, even if you're not in the industry of anti-racist work. I have to out myself a bit. I used to work on Wall Street and did corporate law and global banking and securitization. And in that work, I obviously learned quite a bit about banking regulations and issues surrounding risk factors in banking. Connecting that to what I used since I was 13 in Minneapolis, hawalos, which are informal money transfers. There's been, since 9/11, a discussion about informal money transfers being essentially a huge risk to not just the banks that take in the money from the money transfer businesses, but also just the transfer of money that isn't in a formal regulated banking system. And first, because I was a user for such a long time, I know exactly that about 85% of all Somali people send at least $100 a month, and they send it for survival, right? I came here, I got lucky, I have cousins, I have an aunt, I have family members that are either in refugee camps or still in Mogadishu, Somalia, and my money goes to them. It doesn't go to some nefarious cause. I'm a Wall Street banker at the time, so I mean, that was a bit nefarious. But that frustration of bankers and regulators, especially federally chartered banks such as Wells Fargo, US Bank in Minneapolis, stopped accepting all businesses. And that was done without regulators coming in and explaining to them what the risk factors were. That was done without a study. That was done without any work, right? Because of the inherent risk of not just unregulated sectors, but also the risk of the Muslims sending money abroad that just can't be controlled. That frustrated me, so I decided to write a paper about it, do some research, and presented that at the UN, but also decided to work with state-chartered banks and federally chartered banks and talk to them about what risk are you looking at and how can we help you either change that risk pattern, but also allow you to continue the business that you should be doing. So what I'm saying is, I think every single person that is sitting here comes with a different background and different knowledge in different sectors. And there is a way of connecting that to anti-racist work and anti-Islamophobic work, even if you're a banker.
Thank you. No, it's a very important point because as we've been talking about, all these different things there's not a single sector that you're not gonna see the impacts of systems of oppression, right? Whether it's in job interviews and job applications, car loans, right? Like all these different areas, housing discrimination, maternal death, right? Like all these different areas, you're gonna find some impact of these systems of targeting certain groups and withholding of resources from certain groups that is impacting in different ways, right? So it's important, I really thank you for that. other ways, what are other ways that we resist, that we challenge?
So I would say, similar to what you were talking about, Namira, is like really focusing on the root causes of oppression. I think sometimes it's more convenient to focus on, for example, distorted history of the United States. And I think that that does us a disservice, right? Because if we don't understand the history, we can't change the course of it. I also think, you know, for Muslims in particular, they also have adopted this narrative, for example, that this country was built on religious freedom. But religious freedom for who? It wasn't for Muslims. And so I think we have to understand that history to know what we are using to resist in our own struggles. In addition, you know, what we have seen prior to the Muslim ban is that, you know, at least from the Muslim community, there hasn't been a lot of resistance and protest to the things that have happened to our community, with exceptions, of course. The Muslim ban was, for me as an organizer for over 10 years, one of the first examples of Muslims coming out in large numbers to protest a policy. And I wonder what would have happened. How could the course of the war on terror have changed if we had long opposed these oppressive policies, right? And so I think the point at which we're at now shouldn't be about how do we squash our anger, or how do we, work to become this American, white American model or whatever, but how do we actually embrace our own history, right? Embrace the history of Muslims in this country, right? That starts with the enslaved African Muslims, and how do we use that again to guide our course forward? And I think it's just very frustrating when we use these narratives that obviously are ahistorical and don't apply to us to try to gain acceptance, right? And we've tried, right? You look at the Obama administration, look at the Bush administration, right? People tried, right? They tried to meet with government officials. They tried to change the course of policy. It didn't work. So the question I have too is this the time for, passive action, or is it time for confrontation? And I think at this point, if we're serious about dismantling Islamophobia, we have to be confrontational. We have to confront state violence directly. And then the other thing I would say is to mainstream an anti-war perspective into all of this work, right? The US is a militaristic country. It intervenes in numerous countries around the world, whether it's economic, whether it's militarily. And so if we're not mainstreaming that analysis and lens, we also can't understand what is happening here. And it happens domestically too, right? We're talking about the militarization of the police. I mean, this should be part of all of our analyses because it's guiding the path forward and is rooted, again, in multiple systems of oppressions impacting all of our different communities. And then I agree with Abid in terms of the legal strategy. Around the Muslim ban, Muslim communities did invest a lot of effort into the legal strategy, right? But we know that the Supreme Court often rules on the wrong side. And what changes that is the social and cultural work that has been done by communities, right? It's not about the Supreme Court, all of a sudden having a moral compass. That's not what's gonna change the course of the Supreme Court, right? So thinking about creative strategies to resist and, embracing our identity and the true history of this country to actually dismantle the war on terror.
Thank you. Dahlia, Vanessa.
I would echo all of that. But also, I guess my main contribution would be to follow the grassroots organizers in your community who are generally doing that direct confrontation to the state. Before I was a writer, I was an organizer with the Black Liberation Project in Minnesota. There are other Black Muslim youth organizing, such as the Young Muslim Collective, who did a lot of anti-CVE work. And so it is really important to get in touch with what is happening locally, because each Muslim community within a specific region, within a city, they're going to experience things differently, and they're going to have different reactions because we all have access to different resources, and et cetera. And so, for example, like in New York right now, there's the boycott of the New York Post. And that's something to get involved with at some level. I'm sure DC has stuff. I'm not from DC, so I don't know what y'all are doing out here. But again, like I was saying, in Minneapolis, Black Muslim youth were doing a lot of the work around Islamophobia, anti-CVE, and government surveillance and police brutality and all these different intersections. And if you are unable to participate in certain ways, such as going out to directly confront the police or getting arrested or something like that, that's fine. But you should then be able to find different ways for you to participate and for you to lend support. That can look like financial support, because people need lawyers and people need to get out of jail and people need to have funding to continue community education. But it can also look like, oh, for example, is there a meeting going on? Can you help watch children? Can you do something useful at that meeting? Again, lending support to grassroots organizers, I think, is going to be fundamental to getting any type of change.
Thank you. Dahlia?
And I'll just, I guess I'll just close by, going back to the recommendations I ended my presentation with. But really, at the end of the day, I think it's about being ambassadors for the facts, about educating yourself first, and then spreading facts. Because when you think about the kinds of policies that have been implemented, they relied at a certain level, they relied on misinformation. They relied on misinformation pervasively believed. So, for example, on the eve of the Iraq War, the majority of the American public, more than 75% of the American public, believed there was a direct link between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein, which is, false. It is a false belief, but there was this belief in it, and it contributed to manufacturing consent for a disastrous war. So misinformation is a powerful tool in the hands of government to get the public to consent to things that are ultimately against their own interests. So to be an ambassador for the facts, I would be my call to action.
Thank you. And we do have some volunteers in the back who are going to collect questions. So if you want to start passing questions over to my left, so this side of the room, we will be collecting them and then bring them down. And so while we're doing that, I just want to give a shout out to our sponsors today, the host organizations, the organizations represented on stage, and then kind of sum up some of the points that were made up here before we move into some of the questions. So ISPU, Dahlia is here from ISPU. ISPU conducts objective solution-seeking research that empowers American Muslims to develop their community and fully contribute to democracy and pluralism in the United States. ADC is the largest Arab American grassroots organization committed to protecting civil rights, promoting mutual understanding, and preserving cultural heritage. The mission of Justice for Muslims Collective is to combat institutional and structural Islamophobia in the DC metro area through political education, grassroots organizing, mobilizations, and building alliances across movements. MuslimARC is a faith-based human rights education organization that creates spaces for learning and developing racial equity, connects people across multi-ethnic networks using digital media, dialogue, and storytelling, and cultivates solutions to advance racial equity. Advocates for Youth works alongside thousands of young people here in the United States and around the globe as they fight for sexual health, rights, and justice. And the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity works to support, empower, and connect LGBTQ Muslims. So as I take a look at these questions, I want to also emphasize that there is, one of the things that has come up a number of times is around this analysis piece, right? And around education and training. All of us need that. We all are growing up in societies that are shaped by structural oppression and systems that are impacting our media and what we are learning in schools and the news that we see around us, right? So we're learning this. Every single one of us has unlearning to do and relearning to do. So it is very important to consider that as one very important action step. An opportunity that will be coming up is MuslimARC has a critical anti-Islamophobia webinar training that we will be doing in the fall. And there is a link to RSVP on this website, on the MuslimARC site. So if you are interested in attending this training, it's virtual. That is going to be a very crucial next step. We'll get into the doctrine of discovery, some of the tropes around Islamophobia, and really unpack some of the ways that these tropes are creating this misinformation that leads to specific policies and these consequences. So as I take a look at these questions, I also want to just give all of you like the bullet point key one action item that you want people to remember as they walk out of the room. And we can start at the end with Vanessa. So one key action item, short and snappy.
Read.
I would say making a conscious decision to combat oppression. And I think that this is really important, not only for those of us who are already engaged, but when we think about people that are working in ICE, people that are working at the DHS, CBP, you have a choice, right? And your continued employment at these agencies means you are standing on the side of oppression, and there's no other way to look at it. So I think it's about choice and continuing to resist.
I'd say be an educator and spread the facts.
I would say the enormity of the challenges we face when you just think about what's happening at the southern border, what's happening at the Muslim ban. Yesterday there was the issue, there was the picture out of the father who drowned with his daughter, and that really hit me. I have a daughter that age. You just think, what's going on? What are these issues? So don't lose sight of the enormity. And I know oftentimes we disagree with each other, but particularly those of us that are on the right side, it's time we get serious about addressing these head on with all our efforts. And if we have differences amongst ourselves, we can address those. We can talk about those behind the scenes, but don't lose sight of how fast things are changing. To have concentration camps, to have people dying this way is not normal, and we can't lose sight of that.
I would say believe those that feel oppressed. A lot of times we put the burden of proof on those that are oppressed and make them justify what they felt, if it's systematic oppression or very casual, minor things that happen every single day. If you're an ally and you have a friend that is venting, just listen and believe them. Don't ask them 20 questions. I mean, I'm an attorney, so I do that naturally, but if you're an ally, sometimes all you need to say is, I hear you, this really sucks, and that in itself is a lot. So your curiosity should be something that you need to internalize and do the work. Don't put that on the person that is trying to vent.
Thank you. Center the directly impacted, right? That's often missing from a lot of these discussions. So centering the most directly impacted, letting this be a human issue, right? Sometimes we get into our head so much and we're talking about the facts and the figures and we forget these are human issues. So I think it's really important. Thank you all for that. Can we get a round of applause for the panelists, please? Okay, so there's so many amazing questions in here. I'm going to try and bundle some of them together as much as possible and also just prioritize a few of them because there are some key takeaways that we hope that you'll be able to walk out of the room with. So the first one, does Islamophobia mean fear from or about Islam, right? This is often something that we're unpacking, and I know Maha has a very specific definition of Islamophobia that I've heard her recite on occasion, and then Dalia also talks about what is Islamophobia, if it is, is it fear about Muslims, is it fear about Islam, what is Islamophobia?
I can start with my really long academic definition. So I define Islamophobia as a phenomenon that's meant to articulate contrived hate and fear that is built into structures of the state and society for the pursuit of power and the justification of war and repression. Islamophobia is based on the social construction of Islam as violent, barbaric, uncivilized, and opposed to normative democratic values. It positions Muslims as existing outside of moral boundaries extended to other communities, such that their dehumanization results in consequences ranging from prejudice to discrimination, detention, and even death. Intersectional identities of Muslims across various racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic lines makes the source of Islamophobia difficult to distinctly isolate. However, it represents a particular type of oppression as it operates at the nexus of anti-religious animus, racism, cultural racism, anti-blackness, nationalism, and xenophobia, And last, it's maintained and perpetuated by white supremacy that upholds notions of dichotomous ideological values between the West and Islam. So that's a very long definition, and you can read several other definitions. Since it is a phenomenon, right, it's something that is subjective in terms of how we define it and how people experience it and how it's observed. There are numerous ways you can think about Islamophobia, but the point is that there is something unique to being Muslim that is causing the targeting of Muslims.
Thank you. So we're not going to get like a T-shirt with it on there. Dahlia, other panelists as well. Did you want to comment?
I mean, that's a much more comprehensive definition. My much shorter one that I use is that it's discrimination against people perceived to be Muslim because of an irrational fear of Islam. So, you know, it is focused on the people experiencing the discrimination because they are perceived to be Muslim, because of a belief that their belief system is inherently wrong, inherently not just wrong as in it's not theologically true, but it is an irrational fear of the faith. So there's a link between hating the faith and discriminating against the people. And that's my response to anyone who says, you know, bashing Islam all day is not Islamophobic or is not, is something that's fine to do because it doesn't impact people. I haven't talked about the community. Well, no, by bashing Islam all day and making it exceptionally, believing that it's exceptionally evil, you are then demonizing the group that believes in it.
And Deepa Kumar has like 5 tropes, right, around Islam and Muslims that contributes to Islamophobia. And a lot of them are around like the scale to which Islam is differentiated from other faith groups, right? So Islam is uniquely violent and at a rate that is unheard of in other communities, right? Islam is uniquely misogynist and sexist in a way that no other community could even come close to being that sexist and misogynist, right? Around democracy, around violence, right? Around being
Banking.
Irrational. Yeah, around banking. Like there's just so many places where the rhetoric on Islamophobia is around like the exceptional nature that Muslims are unlike any other community, right? The other thing I want to emphasize from Dahlia's point is around perceived to be Muslim, right? And I want to really bring in the Sikh community as well as other communities that have been perceived to be Muslim and have also been at the brunt of whether it's corporate kind of discrimination, so getting kicked off of airplanes even though they're not Muslim but are being perceived to be Muslim. And this includes, you know, people who are Latinx, people who are African, people who are African American, anybody who is vaguely brown and foreign, right? Whether that foreignness is coming from language or something else, right? There was a man who was on like one of those European flights, and it's either Ryanair or EasyJet. And he was an African Christian man who had a WhatsApp thread that was titled ISI Men, and it was a Bible study group. Iron sharpens iron, right? But somebody, of course, felt that they were allowed to surveil him, essentially, and look over his shoulder and look at the WhatsApp group, and they saw ISI and thought ISIS and got him kicked off the plane, right? This is somebody who's not Muslim. You have Latinx non-Muslims who are speaking Spanish, and people are like, get out of this country, you terrorist, right? Like, so thinking about Islamophobia is how, when it comes to like the facts of Islamophobia and who is perceived to be Muslim, there's all kinds of racial dynamics and xenophobic dynamics that are going into that. So it's important to think about that as well. So on that note as well, there's a couple questions here around like the distinctions between societal Islamophobia or structural Islamophobia, as well as kind of like how is structural Islamophobia different from something like racism, a system of racism. So I was wondering if, you know, briefly we can touch on those differences.
I mean, I can start because I used some of that language in my presentation. When I say societal Islamophobia, I'm talking about perceptions in the public. So, you know, when you do a public opinion survey, how many people endorse anti-Muslim stereotypes? So that's how I define societal Islamophobia. And then structural Islamophobia are policies and practices that the state implements, that the state executes against Muslims. And so the point that I was trying to make is that how the public views Muslims is connected to what the state is allowed to do to this group. And they're basically self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing systems, because the more the state targets Muslims, like what Maha was talking about, the more the public thinks, well, there must be something wrong with this group if they're being targeted so much. And the more that people have, animosity and bigotry toward Muslims, the more the state is allowed to get away with. And so in the Islamophobia index that we look at the endorsement of 5 tropes, and they are very similar to what we just heard: exceptionally violent, exceptionally misogynistic, hostile to the United States, uncivilized, so barbaric, backwards, and then collectively to blame, right? One person does something, the whole group gets blamed. So those 5 tropes, the level of endorsement for these tropes predicts acceptance of bad policies, and that's the link, is that these tropes aren't benign. They're not just like you're going to get mistreated in the airport. It gives the government the consent it needs, the public consent it needs to carry out these policies.
Vanessa, did you want to add anything in terms of distinguishing Islamophobia and racism?
Yeah, can you?
Yeah, it was just around like what is the difference between Islamophobia and racism.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different areas to unpack within that, but however briefly you can do it.
So in brief, Islamophobia can't be viewed as something that is exceptional and standing entirely on its own. Islamophobia is built out of white supremacy, imperialism, anti-blackness, and etc. And so Islamophobia does have a racial, tint to it, depending on who you're looking at. But the problem we run into is when people talk about Muslims as being newly racialized. That's the myth, because Black Muslims are not newly racialized. Black Muslims have been Black, and that's really it. But race in general, we have to remember that this is not something that is biological. Race is invented. And so race is thus flexible. And I see this a lot when I talk about how technology impacts race, and how, for example, artificial intelligence that says it can tell what race you are is embedding pseudosciences that have created these biological, quote-unquote, differences. And that's just to say that as different forms of oppression are starting to become really prominent, or as new technologies are emerging, and you can think of these forms of oppression as technologies, then race can and will kind of shift in order to encompass all of that. And so again, yes, Islamophobia does have a racial tint, lens, however you want to refer to it, but we just can't talk about it as if Muslims are being newly racialized.
And there's a lot of discussion around like terminology, right? Should we even be using the phrase Islamophobia? Should it be anti-Muslim bigotry? Should it be anti-Muslim racism, right? And there's a lot of interesting, I personally find it fascinating, but that's probably why I'm up here, right? Around how to properly, accurately characterize this particular system, right? Because it does reflect all these other systems, but at the same time, there is something unique happening with it, and how long that goes back, how far it goes back, defining that, different people are coming at it from different perspectives. And I want to emphasize that as well, that it's very important because of the amount of diversity within Muslim spaces. There are a number of questions in here around coalition building, and tying to the fact that there are so many different viewpoints, different perspectives, different backgrounds among Muslim communities, and those communities who are perceived to be Muslim. How do we create coalitions in that space, right? And one thing that I always emphasize is that you should not be trying to tell a single Muslim story. There are so many American Muslim stories, as well as when we're looking at the world, so many different stories. So I hope that today you are able to take at least a few useful things from each of these different panelists, because there are very specific backgrounds coming into this space together, just starting to get into like the nuances amongst different communities, different backgrounds, right? So there's no single story. It's important to really think about that as we're creating these coalitions. So another couple questions are specifically tied to like immigration. So I wanted to maybe ask Abid to talk about this a little bit. But one of the questions is specifically tied to the impact of Islamophobia on undocumented Muslims and kind of the post 9/11 framework, and Maha, whoever else wants to speak on it as well. And then tied to like the ICE raids as well. How is that kind of playing out? What are some things that we can think about as we're looking at immigration and Islamophobia?
The impact is clear, and I don't want to get into the pre-9/11 stuff. I think that was mentioned, but you did have the Arabs and Muslims as a whole were looked at differently through the immigration lens, and communities of color since the start of the INA and the immigration process itself. So we won't get into the history, but post 9/11 you began seeing the NSEERS program and the selective raids, the using of census data to target communities with Operation Frontline about 2004. So there have been specific programs implemented just to target the Muslim community. And NSEERS is the first one that comes to mind. Fortunately, we were able, a few weeks before Trump took office, we were able to get NSEERS taken off the books, which was a victory that took, years, over a decade to achieve. But thankfully we did. Had that not happened, you can bet that you would have seen a Muslim ban and a federal register program taking place the same week in January. But the ICE raids themselves, we began seeing after Trump came into office. It was March 2017. The Somali community was targeted in Atlanta and San Diego, Minneapolis. Now you're seeing the ICE raids, of course, going across the country. So when it comes to the immigration issue, it's not only just Islamophobia, it's xenophobia. It's a white supremacist agenda targeting all immigrant communities. And this is what I meant earlier by the enormity of the challenges we're facing on immigration is huge. And it's not going to stop only at the Muslim community or the Arab community. It's going to continue. And there's going to be an attack on legal immigration. There's going to be an attack on, visa issuances and all sorts of things unless we start getting ourselves together in opposing these measures. But it's going to keep going, and part of it is Islamophobia when it comes to the raids and so forth. But the overall xenophobia as well is there.
I just want to point out, or just mention again that the strongest predictors of Islamophobia, the strongest predictors of endorsing anti-Muslim stereotypes are negative views of Black people, of Jews, of the LGBT community. So Islamophobia is one branch on a larger tree of bigotry.
And I agree with Abed that it's rooted in more than just Islamophobia. Because when you look at, for example, or when you think about indefinite detention, right? That was a thing that came up with immigrants. For one, it's obviously been perfected throughout the history of the United States. But if we're looking at the War on Terror, that was perfected at Guantanamo. When we think about the migrant children, they were talking about sending them to Fort Benning. For those of you who don't know, Fort Benning houses the School of the Americas. It has a different name now. And the School of the Americas specifically trains military and paramilitary officials from South and Central America who then go back and torture nationals of their country. So it's rooted in all these different things, right? And the importance of connecting these struggles is that when we're talking about marginalized communities, when the abuse of one marginalized community is allowed to happen, then it also allows for the abuse of other marginalized communities. There's different degrees and extent to which this happens depending on, the history of the group in the country and various tropes and stereotypes. But that's one of the reasons why it's so important to connect these struggles, right? And we think about family separation. We have the enslaved Africans, right? That was a perfect example, an unfortunate example, right, of family separation at the root of this country. So all of these things are not new. So I think, again, to reiterate this point, is to really know the history of this country, to situate these practices in historical perspective.
Just talking about the separation of families, I'm from Minnesota, and Minnesota had a very long history of separating Native American, specifically Lakota and Dakota children from their families and putting them into boarding schools. And I myself know Lakota and Dakota people who still have been separated and have that history and have suffered family trauma through that. So, like you said, it's interesting to think about that as an immigrant that has family now that owns property that was taken from Dakota people.
Sorry, can I add just one more? It's important to keep in mind, too, one of the tactics used by this administration is to throw something out there so absurd that's intended to psychologically beat down on immigrant communities. For example, coming out on a Friday or Thursday afternoon and saying, oh, this Sunday we're going to raid 2,000 families, where people were scrambling, immigrant communities were scrambling, but you had, you know, when you looked at it, you knew this is not possible, but you had to really be in the issue. A few months ago, there was, oh, we're going to start charging asylum application fees. And they threw this out there, which caused a reaction from our community, like, what the hell is going on? And then again, there's the scrambling and how do we respond? So they do this. This is part of their tactic, to keep us so wound up and trying to figure things out where we have to stay focused. But keep aware of these things that they're going to be throwing out there on the immigration front.
And the push is to make sure that we're pitting communities against communities. And the people who are kind of at these intersections of multiple communities, when you have these silos that are created, that's where we lose out, right? And it can mean taking a step back and doing this kind of long-term, deeper work when we are creating coalitions, when we are ensuring that the coalitions have that diversity that's sitting on the edges of groups. So somebody who is Black and Muslim, somebody who is Latinx and Muslim, right? Somebody who is queer and Muslim, thinking about these different areas where people kind of fall through these silos where they're like, oh, well, you're this speaker, and that's the only identity that you are representing, and you're good, right? Like, we don't need to bring anybody else in. So as we're thinking about, there's a few questions here around like systems change, right, and the type of work that's happening, and I'll just end on this before we break for refreshments and close out for the afternoon. When we're thinking about all these different areas of change, every single person in this room has a space that you can do this change. One person cannot do it all. And as we're seeing between something like immigrant detention centers versus private prisons, all these different systems, yes, it might have different language and it might be targeting certain communities, but ultimately the analysis and the experts who are working on these issues around abolition, around reform, around all these systematic changes, there is the ability now to be working together at a much deeper level than when we have been kept apart. Right, and when it's been like, oh, like, let's make sure that you are dealing with your stuff, and as long as you get yours, you're good, right? This idea of buying into whiteness in order to save your community, whether that's suing to be marked as white, ethnically white, or it's whether seeing certain communities become white over time, right? And this idea is that it's this bargain that is being made. You get this access to resources, you are brought into this group, other people are shut out. You're okay then, right? And that's not what this work is about. This work is not about like, oh, as long as my community is good. How are we defining community, right? As long as my community is good, we're good. Like, that's all I'm fighting for, right? So reframing that and then understanding how we can be working across communities, across coalitions, to learn about other people's issue areas, and to join together to do more of this work. It's already happening. You know, a couple of requests came in around like coalition groups in particular. I encourage you to follow some of the panelists on Twitter as well, to get some names and some organizations, as well as, of course, the organizations up here and our social media. So the main thing that I want to leave you with is around that systems change work. Some people are going to work accepting the power relations as they are, right? This is what's happening. Okay, who's providing the healing spaces? Who's providing the lawyers who are showing up? Who's providing the fees to be able to bail people out? Some people are just accepting things as they are and helping people as they are. Other people refuse to accept those existing power relations, right? We are organizing, we are doing advocacy work, we are changing what it is fundamentally. Some people are doing that work, and people fall within that spectrum. Some people are doing the narrative shift work when it comes to academia, the books that are being published, the news that is out there, the fiction and the Hollywood stuff that we see, right? Some people are doing that work and creating narratives that more authentically represent our communities. Other people are doing the legal work and the policy work and legislation and lobbying and all of that stuff. And then some people are providing those direct services kind of work. So there's an area for everybody. And I want to emphasize that together we are stronger. Together has been how this work has been challenged in the past. And because there are thousands of people, like some of you in this room, as well as so many other people across the world who have been providing this defense and offense throughout history, that we are here today. And in this space that we can choose to see each other as fuller humans, that we can fight back against dehumanization, and that we can come together and have this kind of dialogue and exchange. So thank you again to all of you. Thank you to NYU Washington for hosting, and thank you to the panelists. I'm going to throw up the link for the training if you would like to attend and to follow us all on social media. Have an amazing afternoon, and thank you for coming out.
And thank you, Namira, for moderating and doing an
Yes,
excellent
thank
job
you so much.
facilitating.